What if I told you Red Bull has already been caught preparing a completely different car after just 2 races? Because after China, the data is clear. They are not just slower than Mercedes. They are unstable, unpredictable, and for the first time in years, vulnerable. But here's the part nobody expected. This isn't a normal upgrade cycle. Red Bull is fast-tracking a B-specification RB22. A new concept. A new philosophy. Built to fix the one problem even Verstappen cannot drive around. And that changes everything. Because in China, he wasn't fighting for the win. He was fighting the car, lap after lap, just to stay in the race. Now imagine this. A version of that car? That finally gives him confidence again. Or worse, a version that removes the aggressive edge that made Red Bull dominant. That is the gamble. That is the risk. And the decision has already been made. Subscribe now, because what Red Bull is about to unleash could decide the entire championship. Red Bull didn't leave China asking questions. They left with an answer. A very uncomfortable one. Because when they analyzed the data, lap by lap, sector by sector, the conclusion was clear. The RB22 is not just underperforming. It is operating outside its usable window. And that changes everything. Because in Formula 1, a fast car with a narrow window is not a winning car. It is a risky one. A car that can look competitive for a few laps, and then disappear. A car that depends on perfect conditions to unlock performance. And in China, there was nothing perfect. Traffic, temperature changes, long stints. And that is exactly where everything started to fall apart. Because the moment the car moved away from that ideal window, the balance broke. Rear instability, loss of traction, inconsistent rotation. And suddenly, Verstappen was no longer extracting performance. He was controlling damage. And this is where Red Bull made the most important realization of their season. This is not about being slower. It is about being unusable. Because the potential is still there. In clean air, in short phases, the car can still show speed. But over a full race, under pressure, that performance cannot be sustained. And that is why everything is changing. Because Red Bull is no longer asking, how do we make this car faster? They are asking, how do we make this car usable? And that shift is massive. Because now development is no longer about adding performance. It is about unlocking it. And those are 2 completely different challenges. Because to unlock performance, you have to change how the car behaves fundamentally. Under braking, on entry, on throttle, through energy deployment. Every phase must become predictable, repeatable, stable. And that is exactly what the current RB22 is not. And here is where the B specification begins to take shape. Not as an upgrade, but as a correction. A car designed to widen the operating window, to reduce sensitivity, to give the driver confidence again, lap after lap, corner after corner. But this is where the real risk appears. Because when you widen the window, you often lose peak performance. You gain consistency, but sacrifice the extreme edge. And that edge is what made Red Bull dominant. So now they are walking a very thin line between control and aggression, between stability and performance. And getting that balance wrong does not just slow the car down. It changes how it feels, how it reacts, how it can be driven. And that is where everything becomes even more critical. Because this is not just a technical problem. It is a driver problem. Because Verstappen's entire advantage comes from operating at the limit, from trusting the rear, from attacking earlier than anyone else. Now imagine giving him a car that is more stable, but less sharp, less reactive, less extreme. That sounds easier, but it is not. Because it changes his reference points, his timing, his instinct. And that adaptation takes time. Time Red Bull does not have. Because while they are trying to fix this, Mercedes is already executing perfectly. Ferrari is already building consistency. And the gap is already forming. So now this B specification is not just important. It is urgent. Because if it works, Red Bull doesn't just improve. They reset their entire season. But if it doesn't, then this problem goes from temporary to defining. And that is exactly what they are trying to avoid. But here is where Red Bull's situation becomes even more critical. Because fixing the car is only part of the problem. The other part is what they are fixing it against. And right now, they are not chasing a weak field. They are chasing a benchmark. Because Mercedes is no longer experimenting. They are executing. A car that works in every condition. A car that delivers in qualifying, in race pace, in tire management, in energy deployment. And most importantly, a car that drivers trust. Lap after lap. That is the difference. Because while Red Bull is trying to expand its operating window, Mercedes is already living inside theirs. Comfortably. Consistently. And that creates a gap that is not just about speed. It is about confidence. Because when a driver trusts the car, they don't think. They react. They attack. They take risks that others cannot. And that is exactly what Red Bull has lost. For now. But here is where Ferrari enters the equation. Because Ferrari is not dominant. But they are stable. Predictable. Always there. Always collecting points. And that makes them dangerous. Because while Red Bull is trying to solve problems, Ferrari is building pressure. Race after race. Closing space. Reducing margin. And suddenly, Red Bull is not just fighting one team. They are caught in between. Chasing one. Defending from another. And that is the worst position to be in. Because it forces decisions. Fast decisions. Risky decisions. And that is exactly what this B specification represents. Not just a solution. A response to pressure. Because if Red Bull had time, they would evolve the car slowly. Carefully. Step by step. But they don't. So instead, they are jumping forward. Skipping phases. Accelerating development. And hoping the concept works immediately. And that is where the danger multiplies. Because in Formula 1, when you rush a concept, you risk missing details. Small inconsistencies. Hidden weaknesses. Things that don't appear in simulation, but appear on track. Under pressure. At full speed. And this is where everything connects again. Because the current RB22 already suffers from sensitivity. From unpredictability. From a narrow window. Now imagine introducing a new concept. Under time pressure? Without full validation. You are not just solving problems. You are risking new ones. And that is the trade Red Bull is making. Because waiting is not an option. And this is where the role of Verstappen becomes even more decisive. Because when this new version arrives, he will feel it immediately. Not in lap time. In behavior. In how the car reacts when he turns in. When he brakes. When he applies throttle. And that reaction will define everything. Because if he feels confidence again, if the rear stabilizes, if the car finally responds the way he expects, then Red Bull is back. Instantly. But if even a small part of that instability remains, if the window is still narrow, if the car still demands management, then this entire shift is not enough. And that is the line they are about to cross. Because this next version of the RB22 will not be judged by potential. It will be judged by feeling. By trust. By whether the driver can finally stop surviving and start dominating again. And that is something no data sheet can guarantee. Which leads to the question that now defines everything. Not whether the new car will be faster, but whether it will finally feel right. Because in Formula 1, when the feeling returns, everything else follows. But if it doesn't, no upgrade will ever be enough. And now, everything comes down to one moment Red Bull cannot simulate. Because up to this point, everything has been controlled. Wind tunnel. Data models. Simulator runs. Predictions. But Formula 1 does not reward predictions. It exposes reality. And when this B specification RB22 finally hits the track, there will be no interpretation. Only truth. Because the first lap will say everything. Not in the lap time. In the behavior. In how the car reacts under braking. In how it rotates into the corner. In how early Verstappen commits to the throttle. Those details will reveal more than any data sheet. Because when a car is right, the driver stops thinking. Everything becomes instinct. Fluid. Natural. But when something is still wrong, you see it immediately. Micro-corrections. Delayed inputs. Small hesitations that cost time, without anyone saying it. And this is exactly what Red Bull is trying to eliminate. Not just the instability. The hesitation it creates. Because that hesitation is the difference between fighting for a podium and controlling a race. But here is where the pressure becomes absolute. Because this new car does not arrive into a neutral fight. It arrives into a championship that is already taking shape. Mercedes building momentum. Race after race. Ferrari staying close. Consistent. Always there. And Red Bull trying to re-enter the fight. Not lead it. Which means one thing. This car has to work immediately. Not in 3 races. Not after adjustments. Immediately. Because if it doesn't, the gap becomes real. Points. Confidence. Momentum. And those 3 things are almost impossible to recover once they align against you. But here is the final layer. Because this moment is not just about the car. It is about Red Bull itself. Because for years, they have been the team that defines the standard. the reference, the benchmark everyone else chases. Now, they are the ones adapting, reacting, changing direction under pressure. And that shift changes everything internally. Because when you are no longer leading, every decision carries doubt, every update carries risk, every result carries weight. And this B specification is the biggest decision they have made in this new era. Because it is not just an upgrade, it is a statement, a declaration that the original concept was not enough. And once you admit that, there is no going back, only forward. And forward is uncertain. So now everything depends on what happens next. The first run, the first feedback, the first real indication of whether this car has solved the problem or simply changed its shape. Because if Red Bull gets this right, they don't just return. They disrupt the entire championship again. They put Verstappen back in control. They force Mercedes into a real fight. They reset the balance. But if they get it wrong, they don't stay close. They fall behind. Not just in performance, in direction, in belief. And belief is what built their dominance. So now the entire season comes down to a single question. When that car finally hits the track, will it feel like a solution? Or the moment Red Bull lost control of its own era? And this is where the story reaches its final turning point. Because after all the analysis, all the pressure, all the urgency, there is one reality Red Bull cannot escape. This is no longer about catching up. It is about proving they still belong at the front. Because when a dominant team is forced into a reset this early, it exposes something deeper. Not just a weakness in the car, a weakness in the direction. Because great teams don't just build fast cars, they build the right ones. And right now, Red Bull is trying to correct a car that was never fully right for this era. And that is the hardest position to be in. Because now, every gain is recovery. Every improvement is a step back toward where they should have been. Not a step forward beyond everyone else. And that changes the entire dynamic of the season. Because while Mercedes extends, while Ferrari consolidates, Red Bull is rebuilding. And rebuilding always takes longer than expected. But here is where everything becomes even more intense. Because this moment is bigger than one season. Because the 2026 regulations are not going away. This is the new foundation of Formula One. Which means this B specification RB22 is not just about now. It is about the future. Because if this concept works, it becomes the base, the direction, the philosophy for everything that follows. But if it fails, then Red Bull is not just behind this season. They are behind in understanding, behind in concept, behind in how to approach this entire generation of cars. And that is a much bigger problem. Because performance gaps can be closed. Concept gaps take years. And this is why the next races are so critical. Because they will not just show progress. They will show alignment. Whether Red Bull has finally understood what this era requires. Or whether they are still trying to force an old philosophy into a completely new reality. And that is the real risk. Because dominance in one era does not guarantee success in the next. And Formula One history is full of teams that learned that too late. But here is the final piece. Because through all of this, there is still one factor that can change everything. Verstappen. Because if the car gives him even a stable foundation, even a consistent rear, even a slightly wider window, he doesn't need perfection. He creates the difference. Lap by lap, corner by corner. And that is what Red Bull is holding on to. Not just the upgrade, not just the concept, but the belief that if they give him the right tool, he will do the rest. But that belief is now being tested for the first time in years. Because if this new car delivers, everything resets. The narrative, the championship, the balance of power. But if it doesn't, then this is no longer a temporary struggle. It becomes a shift, a real shift. From dominance to chasing, from control to uncertainty. And once that shift happens, it is very hard to reverse. So now everything comes down to that one moment. The moment the new RB22 proves what it really is. Not what Red Bull hopes. Not what the data suggests. What it actually is. On track. Under pressure. Against the best. Because in that moment, we will finally understand something that has been building since Australia. Was Red Bull preparing a comeback? Or witnessing the beginning of the end of their era?